So welcome to today's webinar. We're going to be taking a look at SmartSoft Capture. Now, those of you who are either a newer user to FileHold, if you've joined FileHold in the last couple of years, you'll have a copy of this software. Every deployment of FileHold gets one license of this available to be used. Additional licenses can be purchased or upgraded, and I'm going to cover some of those in the intro today. But I just want to start with talking a little bit about what SmartSoft Capture is. It's a third-party software designed for intelligent capture of metadata from scanned forms. That's not a limitation, it's just that's what it was designed for. One license of Capture is provided every new install of FileHold. Capture requires the FileHold desktop application to run. So if you're using the web client, you'll need to also install the desktop application to support Capture. And Capture is based on a product called SmartSoft Invoices, which is a more comprehensive invoice scanning tool. It can do things like line item capture of elements, and it can do breakdowns. It's basically been designed to capture an invoice and bring the whole thing into an accounting software. And it's a much more aggressive and finely detailed process than what FileHold needs, which is just metadata capture. And so as a result of that, we can talk about when we want to use Capture as opposed to another product. So it's designed that you could use Capture with any document, whether it's scanned or electronic, but it's best used with short documents, that is 1 to 3 pages. If you have a multi-page document, you can certainly use Capture to bring it in, but it may not be the most efficient way to perform an OCR search over top of the document. Secondly, anything that has a standardized layouts. Random layouts on documents are not optimized. What Capture does is it learns the pages as it goes through. So the more standardized the layout is, the easier it is to bring that information across. When it has a text base as opposed to a handwritten base. So a form that someone fills out with a pen is less useful for Capture than it is a scanned document that someone types and hands in. So scanning, we're talking about scanning text here as opposed to handwriting. Something where visual validation is required. Simply processing a document for an optical character recognition or OCR layer over top of a document is not using Capture to its most capacity. And then finally, you can use it for scanned or electronic documents. There is no difference as far as Capture is concerned with what the input is. When there's already a text layer built into the document, such as an electronic document, it can often be faster in order to do the processing for it. Now, the opposite of these are also true. So long documents, random layouts, handwritten documents, you can still use them with Capture, but the process isn't optimal. So I'll be sticking with text-based short documents with a standardized layout for today's demonstration. Now, beyond Capture, I was saying that you can add additional licenses. You can also upgrade the software. The first version of that is called SmartSoft Capture Plus. Now, it's not super different than the SmartSoft Capture that you're going to see today. It does have an enhanced OCR engine, so it's using a more powerful OCR tool. So in case you're dealing with a lot of low-quality scanned documents or where a greater level of OCR clarity is required, it also offers an enhanced barcode support. So it essentially has a library of additional barcodes that it can recognize when they come into the system. SmartSoft Capture Pro is another version of it. Now, it's a much different deployment than Capture. It's a server-based deployment. You can install it on your local server, or you can put it in SmartSoft's cloud. So you can essentially use them as the host for it. It's a pay-per-click software. So you're paying for the number of scans you're doing per month or for a period of time. It's not sort of like with SmartSoft Capture, where you have it on a perpetual license. I should also mention that Capture Plus also offers that same perpetual license. Once you have it, you keep running it as long as you have FileHold. Capture Pro can handle a much higher volume of documents. We typically talk in terms of capture of a few dozen pages per day. That's often we recommend for the guidelines. Capture Pro has line item capture, so if you're looking for that invoice style capture, it can do that. It also allows multiple templates per batch. So one of the limitations that you'll see with Capture is one template per batch. We'll talk about that in a moment. We also have SmartSoft Invoices, which should be notable, and that's independent of FileHold. So you can run invoices without FileHold. If you're going to use Capture, Capture Plus, or Capture Pro, you need to have FileHold along with it. So it needs to be a partner software to that. Invoices is exactly the same thing as Capture Pro. It's just it can run independently of FileHold, and you would buy that directly from SmartSoft. We'd be happy to make the introduction, but you likely won't need to. We'd recommend you go with Capture Pro in order to bring your documents over. All right, so with that, let's go on to the demo and take a look at some stuff. So let's just head back into FileHold here. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up my desktop application for FileHold, and I'm just going to do a quick refresh. The only reason I'm doing this is because the license for Capture validates against your desktop application. So because I haven't used this in a little bit, I'm just going to refresh everything to make sure my license is still being supported when I'm using Capture. So I'm going to open up Capture down here. And this is likely what you'll see when you bring open Capture for the first time. Let's do a quick tour around the screen here. We have our session information. So if we have thumbnails for documents, they're going to appear into here. It's also where I can open documents. So if I have a PDF or a scanned image, I can point Capture towards that. It's also where I can scan a document and bring it over into the system. We have the yellow bar up here, which kind of gives you tips as to where you are with the system. I don't use this, so I typically close this right away because I just find it visual on the screen and I don't need it. From here, the rest of the screen is divided into 3 areas. This is your form view. This is where you're going to be entering your metadata for the document into here. You have your zoom view down here. I often make this just a little bit bigger because my form view isn't usually too dense, so I don't need to pull up that much information. I'd rather see my zoom in bigger views. You'll see that in a moment. And then, of course, our image view, which lets us actually look at the document that we've scanned in fuller detail than against the the thumbnail that we have over on the left. Now, when we're dealing with a form coming in, we're going to be dealing with one style of form at a time. So if you have batch scan documents, Capture is not appropriate for that. When I say batch scan, I mean multiple kinds of documents put together. I have a mix of invoices and AR documents, and I've got some packing slips in there and some bills of lading, and I've scanned them all together into one bundle. Capture is not a great tool for sorting those out. We're dealing with one document at a time with this. Capture Pro can deal with that batch scan, but not Capture in and of itself. So just worth flagging that at the beginning. We then need to decide what our template is going to be for what we're using here, what our form is going to be. We control that over here under File with the active form definitions. So you can see that I have a whole bunch of different form definitions, a lot of ones that I've built for demonstrations and whatnot, and a lot of ones I've done just to make sure I understand the functionality of the software. You're going to have an invoices template. If you've never used Capture before, when you bring this open, it's going to default to the invoices template. You can't change that one. It's locked into here with the following 4 fields: vendor, invoice date, invoice number, and the total. And if you're scanning invoices, this is likely going to be all that you're going to need. But if you're scanning something that's not an invoice, you might want to change this to its own custom field. We do that over here through File and Edit Document Form Definitions. And it gives me my list of form definitions over here on the left, and then what the actual fields are over here on the right. So I'm going to select my invoices template. This is the stock one that comes with this, and I'm going to make a new template for our purposes today. So we're going to click on Add. It's going to ask if we want to copy. Because you have the invoices template, that's what we're going to use for our copy. So we're going to say OK, and now we give it a unique name. So we're going to call it Webinar Invoices, because that's what that'll help me to remember why I built this later on, built it for my webinar. So I've got my fields, and now I can edit the information for this. There's a bunch of information under the form fields, and I'm just going to take us through these from one part to another. The title is what you want to type into this. It's whatever you want to call it. It's up to you. The ID name, on the other hand, has a specific format for it: FT underscore, and then the word that you want it to be. So in this case, we've done a direct match. So invoice number to invoice number, total to total, etc. For the most part, these are independent of each other, but I want to point out that the ID name for FT vendor name is actually important because this is linked to a database. We're going to see more of this in a moment. The rest of these are essentially independent fields. Capture only supports one internal database, and it will support it for the vendor list because it's what it's going to use to control the forms. So in other words, if I bring in an invoice from PepsiCo, then Capture will remember the layout for the PepsiCo invoice based on the vendor name. On the other hand, if I have an invoice from Coca-Cola, it's going to remember the layout for Coca-Cola. So it helps me to use the vendor to create a different form template that it remembers for each time. And this is why when we're processing an internally created document where the formatting is the same, we want to avoid using this particular field. We want to avoid using the vendor field because it's going to link it to that database and hold a different template for each one. So that even though your vendor for an AR document is a different vendor each time, it's going to try to remember the form difference. It's going to have to relearn the form every time you put it through. So In other words, if you're going to do an AR document, instead of using vendor, use payee or something like that that doesn't link it to that particular name. We want to make sure it's something different. In this case, vendor is ideal, so I want to keep that. We then have our format for it. And when I select my format, I can choose how to enter it. There's a lot of these are very common, such as a text field versus a date field versus a checkbox versus a drop-down list. It's how you want to enter the information into here. Next, we have our flags, and this is how Capture is going to treat this particular element. Now, a lot of these we don't use for most of our typical setups. When we get into some more advanced setups, there are some functions in this that we can use. And in the next session, we're going to talk a little bit about some of these, not all of them, but we're going to look at a couple of them. What I want to show you right now is a few of these under here. So the first one is assignable. Assignable means use the OCR, the optical character recognition engine, to find a value on the document and bring it across to the form. Selectable means that we're going to give you a series of options and you can choose for it. So then under the options over here, you could choose selectable and then data input the options on this field underneath. Checkable means yes or no. It means it turns into a checkbox for your data entry. Required. Capture will not allow the document to be exported until the required fields are satisfied. Virtual means it has some level of visual image that's attached to it, and it may not be an exact match to text. And browsable means that something can be found on the page. Now, the rest of these things like calculable, high precision, soft validation, non-exportable, etc., these are some high-level functions that are used. More of these have to do with SmartSoft Invoices or SmartSoft Capture Pro. So we're not going to use most of these. We're going to mainly focus on the ones that I have here, such as this is a vendor field, and so it is assignable and required. This one is assignable and required, assignable and required, assignable and required. So we're just going to stick with those for today. Format expression, if you're using a regular expression into this, you can force it into the language. We're not going to be covering this. One, because I'm not familiar enough with regular expressions to answer the question, and two, because again, it's rarely used for an invoice style. But if you're doing something more formal with your processing, you could use a regular expression to reformat the text that's found into something that matches. So for example, forcing a date, instead of it being, for instance, today is 07/19/2023, having it say July 19th, 2023, that's a format expression you could force onto the document. Options are the items that we're going to put underneath this for its selection. So if I want to make something to have an option, so, Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, I could put my 3 options under here and then include those as selectables from my dropdown. Whether or not I have a dependent item or dependent values, dependent items are where I have something from another cell that I want to say must be completed in order for this to be here. Again, we won't be touching this. Default value, what I want this to appear as if it doesn't find anything on the page, can be useful if you have dummy information. And then the formula. Now, what I really wanted, which again is really only used for calculations, which we won't be doing. Now, what I wanted to show you is these ones over here, sample headers and exclude headers. So if I have a value, for instance, this is the vendor field, vendor name, vendor, or account name are all potential headers. You could say that I've got another name for this and I want to have customer on this. Then where it finds customer, it might use the number beside that. But because we're looking for the name, I want it just to be customer instead of customer number. Let me just cancel that. I don't actually want to make any changes. Invoice date, pretty simple. Invoice date, date, or order date. For the invoice number, we've got invoice number, INV, invoice no, or invoice number sign. So those are all other ways that it might find an invoice number. What this does is where it finds INV on the page, then it's going to know that's potentially going to be an invoice number, point me towards that. It helps it to find the information. So if you have a standardized document and there's an abbreviation or a piece of information in the header or before the document, then that's a great time to use a sample header for it to help Capture get smarter with finding the information into here. It's interactive. We also have an exclude function to this. Same idea, except we can get rid of things. So here it's saying, instead of using a number, if it's an account number, don't use that. Use the invoice number instead. So it's saying exclude the invoice number. We can also exclude values. So if there's an output that we want, so we don't want, for instance, $0 to ever be found within an invoice total. So we don't accept the $0 invoice. So we might use that as an exclude value. The rest of these we're not really going to be touching for most of these sessions. Let's now come back to the front here, and we're going to build ourselves a new field. So we can add this by coming into this, and we want to give this a title. So in this case, we're going to call this purchase order number. And then for our field name, I could keep this like that, but why make the extra work for myself? So we're going to go PO underscore, and let's just keep that in capitals. So we're going to call it PU num. So PO num, so we've got our purchase order number that we're going to attach to our documents. We're going to keep it text because that's all it needs. Now I could change this to an integer field or a money field or any of those, but I want to keep this as text. There's a special one up here for invoice numbers. We're not going to be using that one either. And then I've got assignable set to this automatically. We are not going to make this required because if a PO number isn't on the invoice, I don't want that to be a barrier for it coming into FileHold. So I'm not going to make that a required field. And then over here for our sample headers, we'll do PO number, and then we'll do PO number, purchase order number. Oh, let's put the R into there. There we go. Perfect. So now I've got some values into this. I've given some sample headers to help Capture find the documents coming across. Excellent. Now that I've done that, I can save this as my form field for webinar invoices, and we're going to say save. Now my form here has not changed, and it won't change until I do two things. First of all, let's double check and make sure we're on webinar invoices. It's not going to actually make a change until I add a document to this. Only then will the form view change. So don't be afraid if you create your custom form and you don't see any differences here. It's not going to appear any different until you add your document in. So now that our template is set up, before I bring my document over, there are a few settings that I want to adjust into here. So we can do that up here by the tools, and then we can get into the settings. So in the settings, we have a few tabs. We're going to start with our general tab over here. That's what I'm going to turn on or what I'm going to turn off. And our first one here is enable OCR processing. What this does is it turns on the OCR engine to crawl the document to look for text within them. Now, why would you ever turn off OCR processing? If I was dealing with purely electronic documents, no scans, that have a text layer, it's going to be faster to not crawl them than it is to just bring them into the system and allow the text to be found as text. We also have fast processing turned on. I keep fast processing turned on because I find typically it is okay for its speed. Now we can turn that down if we want greater accuracy. If you're using SmartSoft Capture Plus, you will not be able to turn off the OCR processing, and fast processing will not be able to be disabled. So it's going to be using the better engines for it. That's the whole point of Plus. We have enabled auto despeckle of images. I leave this turned off. If I've got dots on the image, it doesn't matter to me too much, or more importantly, I don't want to spend the time for them to process. Well, I can enable auto orientation. So if it's been slightly skewed or if it's been scanned at 90 degrees, this will reorient it so that it reads up and down. It's looking for text as text. Keeping blank pages. I leave this turned off because if I have a blank page that was scanned by accident, I want to get rid of it. So a blank page, by the way, needs to be 100% blank. Any markings on it, even artifacts that are found from when you scan a document, will prevent that blank page from being removed from the system. So keep blank pages. I usually leave this deselected because if there's text on it, it's going to come through anyway. Enable barcode recognition. Capture can read barcodes as the value that the barcode is written in. So if I have a barcode for 123, then I put that into there. It can read that as a text field for 123. Now, FileHold, as you may know, doesn't recognize barcodes. So this can be used to pre-process your document to make sure it has its barcodes attached to it so that it can properly read those through. Graphics cleanup mode. This is what it's going to allow you to sharpen your image as it comes through and to clean up the graphics. I typically don't use this. The reason is I'm processing these documents to capture the text. My goal in mind is to capture text as metadata from the documents, process and bring them across. I don't care about the graphics, so I don't really need to clean them up. So I say no cleanup because it's just going to be faster. Now down here for the input, enable document separation. This is a key function for looking at separating documents when they've been batch scanned together. Now when I say batch scan, I mean multiple documents of the same type. We're not dealing here with document distinction from one kind to another. We're dealing with separating to put them into different piles of documents. So when it comes to document separation, enabling this means that Capture can use different modes to help to distinguish one document from another. So if I enable this, then it's going to go either from auto mode, where it's going to try to do its best guess at what it is, to one document equals one file. So if I add 16 documents into here, it would give me 16 documents, quote unquote, regardless of how many pages each document is. So this is not useful when I'm dealing with a single batch file, but it's great if I'm dealing with multiple files of different page lengths. Don't try to separate them. Each one of those documents that I'm adding in is one file. Check-based merge, if I have something that is the size of a check, that is not the size of a piece of paper, but the size of a check stub, or sorry, a check itself, then it's going to separate each time it hits a check. So if I scan a check and then the stub, and a check and then the stub, it separates automatically when it hits the next check. Use barcode separators. You can produce a separate page. If I click onto this and go into my settings, then the barcode can be read as the word separator, but I can put whatever value into this is necessary. The separator page is then removed from the scan. So we don't use these like a sticker to put on top of an existing document to say, here's a new document, separate from here. We use these as a full sheet in between each one of the documents to indicate, here's a brand new document coming across. And then we finally have a fixed page count. So if I'm dealing with 7-page invoices, every one of them is 7 pages, there is no exception to it, then I could fix that count at 7 pages and have them come across. And it's going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, new document. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, new document. So we can use that as an option too. Moving on, enable poor quality warning. Let me just turn that off. Enable poor quality warning. You'll see this enabled. I usually leave this turned off. If it's a low quality document, my eyes will tell me that. I usually don't need to see this, but it's there if you want it. And restrict file loading to sample invoices only. Well, we're going to want to see more than just the samples, so I'll leave that one turned off as well. Now you can set up a watched folder for Capture, but we want to be careful. It does not function in the same way as the FileHold watched folder does. So if you know about the FileHold watched folder, it runs when FileHold is running and goes out and looks for the documents. But I can add documents into there when I'm not using FileHold, and then the next time I start up FileHold, it goes out, looks in the folder, and brings those across. When you're using the watched folder in Capture, it only runs when you're running Capture. So if you add documents when Capture is off, Capture will not bring those in. That's not how that watched folder works. If I want that watched folder function like FileHold, we want to use a shared watched folder where we're linking over to that folder, and then you can add whatever you want to in there. The next time you start up Capture, it brings those documents over. So the shared watched folder is definitely the tool for that. Restore last session at startup, I leave this turned off. Enable backup and restore so that if you suddenly lose power to your computer the next time you start it up, it's going to ask you if you'd like to bring up the last session. This will automatically restore the last session. Now the rest of these tabs I'm not going to worry so much about, but I do want to describe a couple of them here quickly. For instance, the interface, we're not going to really spend any time on. You can explore this if you'd like to. Validation, we're not doing any validation on this because all we're doing is processing metadata. So we're going to skip that. Scanner, if you have a scanner you want to point this at, you can absolutely do that. There's 2 ways to bring documents over into Capture. You'll see the 2 buttons over here. One is to open, to bring a document over from the file. And the other one is to scan it live and bring the document across. I typically recommend bringing documents over from file as opposed to bringing them over from scan. That way you don't have to sit there, scan the document, click scan over here, scan the next page, click scan over here, bring in the next document, etc. You can just batch scan them at one time, then go to your workstation and process the documents. These are the 3 that I wanted to show you. We're going to start here with the archive. When you scan a document and you send it over into Capture, it's going to make a new version of that scanned document called the archive. That will have a text layer applied to it. So if you didn't have a text layer onto the document, if there was no text involved with that document, it now has a text layer. That's a new version. It becomes what's called the archive. So when you import into FileHold, you're not importing your scanned document, you're importing your archive document. So we can have it automatically remove the archive once it's completed its export. You can choose whether or not to export the archive. We always want to export the archive. We can convert to PDF, which I leave selected. So if I scan a JPEG and feed it into this, I output a PDF. That's my preferred way of dealing with the document. You can maintain it in its original format by doing it as a JPEG, but I think a PDF makes more sense. Delete the source file after archive. Now, I don't use this until I'm confident in my system, because it means once I run the document through Capture, I lose the original copy of the document. You may not want that. Auto archive when closing the application. So if I close this, archive the document so that it's stored within the system. Enable archive database means that we're going to turn on the database and it's going to remember what we've already scanned into the system. I leave that turned off as well. I'll decide what I want to scan, what I don't want to scan. Now we can also copy the input PDF instead of generating a new one. So this means that we are going to not export a document with an OCR layer built into it, although we've relied on an OCR layer for the processing. So if you need to keep your non-OCR documents non-OCR'd, you can use that. By default, we're going to export in black and white, but we can also say keep color and then turn the compression up. Now, this is often important because if we want if we want the compression to be aggressive, so the higher we move the compression, the lower the quality is going to be of the scan. I have this set fairly low at 10%, but you can turn this up if you want to. So the larger the compression, the more aggressive we're going to be on the document. Usually the poorer the image quality is when it comes to a color document. Now, this is why I always ask the question, do you need color documents stored into the system? Is it important that if the document was sent to you in color, that you keep it as color? What is your purpose behind having these documents? If I'm scanning historic records, then I probably want to keep those electronic documents. They're important to me, and I also want to keep them in the quality they've been given. If I'm dealing with an invoice, I don't care if it's color or black and white. What I care about is that I've kept a document for my internal accounting processes and that I can defend against an audit if necessary later on. So keeping those two thoughts in mind, you might find that a black and white is actually just as valid and keeps it small in the system. When we do an export, we are going to produce two documents from Capture. The first one is going to be the archive, that's our PDF, and our second one is going to be the XML export. This is what actually holds the metadata for your document. Now, the default for this is to do all documents in one XML file. So if I have 10 documents that I'm exporting, I'm going to have one XML file that relates back to each one of those. You can set this to one XML per document, but it's not necessary. The batch is actually the better way to do this because it's going to process a lot more cleanly when it comes into FileHold. We want to remember what the default location is for the archive, which in my case is going to be cscans. That's the default. And then it's also going to be over here for the XML export, which is also going to be cscans. The XML export is going to point at the archive location. So if I need to, when I'm feeding this into the manage import process for FileHold, and I use my XML export, I need it to point at the cscans location. So it's not necessary that my XML export and my archive are in the same place, but they need to be consistent. If they're inconsistent, this is not going to work. So I also want to point out over here that I don't browse and use the default folder when exporting because I'm just going to send it to the same place every time. I don't need to tell it what to do. Remove exported documents from the current session. When I'm testing, I leave this turned off, and I'll explain why. When I'm doing a test, I'm probably going to export the same document multiple times. We're going to see this in the next session when I set up my managed import. So when the managed import is set up, I'm going to export that one document multiple times back to the same place. So I'm going to keep exporting the same document to make sure the process works. Once I'm confident with the process, I can come back and I can remove that exported document from the session. But I leave this turned off, although I immediately leave it turned on as soon as I'm good with the system. Validate documents before export. We're not doing a validation, so that can be turned off. Add a tag with all recognized text. I don't want to do that because I don't want to import all of my text within the XML file. It will not be a value. And then finally include the archive file path. Must be there because it's going to point to where the archive is going to be found within the XML, which is required for the managed import. All right, so that's our nickel view of the different functions over here. Last thing I want to show you is the internal database. So you'll see that I've got vendors over here, but when I select items or accounts or company codes, none of these are going to be available for me. The only thing that's available for me is vendors. It's the only database that's attached, and this is a list of the different vendors who I have built into the system. So when I add in a document from any of these companies, then Capture is going to remember what the last time I brought in a document from that looked like. So if I was to, for example, clear my list out, I'm now going to have nothing in my templates, so I've got nothing to base this off of. So we're going to be reteaching this information to Capture, which is a good thing for in the case of what we're doing here today. We also have an email import function, which lets us hook this up, be able to read incoming attachments to documents and have them scan through. Not part of our training today, so we're going to ignore this. All right, so I've made my changes to this, and we're going to say OK. And now I'm ready to start bringing in my first document. So before we do anything else, we want to come over to our active form definition and make sure we are on the correct form. Just get into the habit of doing this. It'll save you a lot of heartbreak later if you were on the wrong form by accident. So we'll choose the webinar invoice, and then we'll click on open, and we're going to direct this towards bringing in an invoice. I'm going to choose this one, and we're going to say open, and now it's going to load the image. This is why we don't want to do large sizes of documents, because it does two things. The first thing it does is it loads a document, and then it processes the document. So if I've got 500 pages here, it's going to take that length of time per page to finish processing. If I'm doing more than one document at a sitting, I'm probably going to want to load these up and then go do something else. I don't want to sit here and watch it process against the documents. So we now have our information that's been input into here. Now, let's take a look at our screen. So our form view has been populated with some fields. Down here under our zoom view, it's given us what it's zoomed in on over on this area. And then it's run a text layer over top of all of these fields. So it's found some information onto these that it's going to be using. So as I run my mouse over top, it shows me what each of them have to do with the item that I've selected. So now we can use this to come through and validate our fields. So our first one over here, as soon as I click on the field, it shows me where it found it over here. It also gives me a highlight. So I'm now going to click on the date. Keep your eyes peeled over here under the date. I click this, and it zooms and gives me a yellow highlight over top of this here for the date. So again, it's giving me a zoom over here for Rattlesnake Canyon, and we can see it's misread this value over here. It's missed an E, and it hasn't found the other C. So we need to do some small changes to this. So just within the text field here, I'm going to add in my E, and then I'm going to replace that with a capital C. So now I've got Rattlesnake Canyon Grocery. That's the name of my business. That's what I want it to be. That's now my validated field. This is why we have a validation check to make sure that it's reading the information right. I can now select onto this, and I can add this to my list. Remember, my vendor name is based on a database. So I want to pull this information across. We're going to say add to list, and we've now added that, and it goes black. Black means that it's a validated field. So the next time it sees a Rattlesnake Canyon Grocery, and it knows to find that information over here, it knows to associate this vendor name with that from that name that it found within the scan. And so we're validating this as it comes through. Move on to our next field. So we've got our invoice date. There it is down here. So we can see 10852, and the invoice date is over here, 2018. So it's got my field into place. If we want to make sure that our data is in the right field, I can open up the date picker, and I can make sure that it's reading the right field. So in this case, I want it to be the correct date. So we're going to go back to 2018. So let's just zoom back, 2018, and then we'll go to June and 29th. There we go. So I've now redone that date, but that's how I want it to be. And I picked the wrong month, I just realized. There we go. And this is why I typically don't try to re-enter the dates. It's usually valid for the information that's put against it. Next one down is invoice number, and you'll see that it hasn't quite read the correct invoice number, so I'm just going to zoom over top of that with my text bracket, and now it grabs the whole thing and it's read it through correctly, and it goes black because I've entered that information in. The total of this, 2984. We can see that matches our total down here because it's used the total clue, so that's good. And then we can quickly scan our document. We can zoom out if we want to see it, but we've got no PO number to it, so we're going to leave this empty for the document. And I've now validated this document. I'm ready to now export this to somewhere else. But let's bring in another document and go through that process again. So this time we're going to open and we're going to add 2 documents over here. So I've got 2 dummy documents, one of which is a low quality scan and the other of which is a badly scanned document, which are 2 subtly different things. So let's start with our poor quality scan. So you'll see it's still processing up here. So it may not show me the preview of the document, but there it has. So here's my lower quality scan. If I zoom in on this, you'll see what I mean, that I've got quite a bit of fuzziness around here. Not as bad as it could be, but certainly not a crystal clear document. So it hasn't found everything on this, but it's found some of my fields of information. I'm now ready to take a quick look at this. So we're going to start with the vendor name, which I'm going to select from over here. Premium Springs Water Company. I'm now ready to add this to the list. And as soon as I do, we're in the black because we're a validated field. Invoice date, 3/26/2012. Yep, that's correct. So we're going to move on to our next one, which is the invoice number. Yes, that's correct. Our total, $89. Yes, that's correct. And do we have a purchase order number on this? No, we don't. So we're now ready to move on to our next document. We select. Because all of these fields are blank, nothing's in over here. Now it's misread this document because it's clearly done this and it's zoomed it all the way, it's flipped it the wrong way. So I'm not going to bother. Let's just rotate this page 180 degrees. Might take a moment. There it is. And it's flipped it around. And now I can go through and I can choose my fields. So we'll choose my first one here. So WKRP in Cincinnati. And then we'll add this information in. So we'll add it to my list, invoice date. So 2017. Doesn't seem to be finding the information on this. I think it's because when it flipped it, it didn't read the language right on it. So again, it's not usually something that happens. So in the rare chance that these moments happen, I'll just go through and manually tag the fields. So January 2nd, and then our invoice number, which is here, and I'll just shrink that box down so that I get just the value for it, 201702. And then our total at the bottom, 150, and that's good. We validated all of our fields. We're checked on all of these. No further work that I need to do at this point. I can now hit my export button. Now, when I hit export, what it's going to do is it's going to take our 3 images, set them up as an archive, and then attach the metadata fields to these that I want and export that as an XML file. So now if I navigate through Windows, I can go over to my C drive. So let's just come down here to my C drive and my scans, which is just right here. That's the default location that I set. So this is the XML I just output. So if I double click this, and this is always a bit crunched into this. Let me just turn off the word wrap. Oops. You know what? Instead of opening this with that, I'm going to open this up with my Notepad++. That's better. Okay, so here is the XML that I got. So it has my vendor name, Rattlesnake Canyon Grocery, 2018, 10852, 2984, no PO number. So it's tagged these fields to this particular document. This is the archive that it's going to output. Moving on to the next one, forms, webinar invoices, the metadata fields, and then the name of the document up top. So it's done this for all 3 of them, and that's now been bundled into this one XML file. Then we've got my documents over here, and these are the exported documents. So if I was to double click this, I'm going to open it up with, in this case, Adobe Acrobat. And if I go Control A, we can see all the different fields that it's grabbed off the document, ready to be processed further from a text recognition, be able to find the word FileHold, for example, within the text of that document. So these documents are now ready for import into FileHold. To do that, I'm going to want to set up a managed import for myself. And that is what we're going to cover in our next session. So we're going to cover a managed import. We're going to have a quick look at them. And then we're also going to take a dive into Capture and just have a look at some of the other tools that we have to be able to more quickly navigate around and find the information on top of the document.